Good day, everyone. I am Jensen Ramos Abajo, your presenter for today. For today's lesson, we are going to explore the definition of myth. At the end of this lesson, you are able to identify what is myth, what are their purpose, and what they entail. So without further ado, let's get started. In this presentation, different types myth describe as something grand and large, older and more epic than a fairy tale. However, myth as a term has a wide range of meanings and interpretations. So, what is myth? The term myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which at one point in time meant words or anything that was spoken was considered a mythos. The term was later redefined to include any story or any telling of an event, and later it became truth or something that people believed in. Today, we simply define myth as an ancient stories, but it is how we look at a story which decides how we will interpret it. There are almost hundreds of ways myth can be interpreted, but generally, they can be broken down into two specific ways: literal and symbolic. Symbolic suggests only representation of ideas and explanations of natural occurrences. A good example would be etiology myth or natural phenomenon. We will look at myth as a way of explaining daily, monthly, or yearly occurrences, like the sun rising, the wind blowing, or even in natural disasters. Loki's punishment at the hands of Skoti and Odin shows how earthquakes were explained by the Norse. When the snake which sat above his head dropped its poison on him, he would struggle against his bond, so viciously he would make the earth shake and thus create earthquakes. Another example of symbolic myth would be charter myth, also sometimes called functional myth, where myths were used to encourage certain behaviors or to teach morality. This myth also explain what should and shouldn't be done in society. A good example would be the legend in African mythology of how the cheetah got its steer tracks. A very lazy Zulu hunter saw the cheetah hunting in the field and decided if he had a cheetah of his own, then he would never have to hunt again. So when cheetah was out, he stole all three cubs. And a Sangoma or witch doctor later found cheetah are crying. And then, when he asked her what was wrong, she told him her three cubs were missing. He found the thief and took the cubs back to the cheetah. So today, the Tia tracks at the cheetah is a reminder to all Zulus that you are responsible for your own food and you should never expect nature to do it for you. Let's proceed to literal mythology. This is self-explanatory. These stories are accepted to have really happened, and everything we read can be seen as truth. A good example of this would be historiorism, where myth is rather history than plain story, only distorted over time. Mythologists, or rather historians in this case, look at old myth as proof of certain cultures' existence, shifts in power in society, and events that happen in history which only lives in these stories. A very good example of this would be the Amazon warriors, whose proof of existence is disputed to this day, or even the legend of King Arthur. There are hundreds of different ways, even more how we can look at mythology or interpret it. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud even have their own interpretations, which really could make up their own video, but I hope this presentation gives you a small taste or an idea of how vast mythology can be and how different ways we can interpret and look at it. Now, let us take a look at the variety of meanings and interpretations of myth according to our different resources. What are the characteristics of myth? A myth has no identifiable author. A myth that is written down in a literary form uses a story that preceded it. Sometimes the myths are even different in detail. One version is not more true than other. And what are the purposes of myth? Mythology serves many purposes, such as myth grant continuity and stability to a culture. Myth present guidelines for living. Myth justify a culture's activities. Myth give meaning to life. Myth explain the unexplainable. And finally, myth offer role models. Alright, so since we were able to define what is myth, at this point in time, let's go ahead and dive into the oral lore from pre-colonial times in Philippine mythology. Filipinos often lose sight of the fact that the first period of the Philippine literary history is the longest. Certain events from the nation's history had forced lowland Filipinos to begin counting the years of history from 1521. The first time written records by Westerners referred to the archipelago, later to be called Las Islas Filipinas. Through the researchers and writings about Philippine history, much can be reliably inferred about pre-colonial Philippine literature from an analysis of collected oral lore of Filipinos whose ancestors were able to preserve their indigenous culture by living beyond the reach of Spanish colonial administrators. Philippine mythology is the body of stories and epics originating from and part of the indigenous Philippine folk religions, which include various ethnic faiths distinct from one another. The mythologies and indigenous religions of the Filipino have historically been referred to as anitism, meaning ancestral religion. Another terms used were anitismo, a Hispano-Filipino translation, and aniteria, a derogatory version used by most members of the Spanish clergy. Today, many ethnic peoples continue to practice and conserve their unique indigenous religions, notably in ancestral domains, although foreign and foreign-inspired religions continue to influence their lifeways through conversions, intermarriage, and land buying. Here are some examples of Philippine myths. The Tagalogs pride their myth of Bernardo Carpio, a folk hero said to hold the mountains of San Mateo apart with his powerful arms to prevent them from colliding. A famous story that tells of the origin of man and women is that Malakas and Maganda, who came out of a bamboo after being pecked by a bird. This and other stories of equal birthing of man and women throughout the archipelago assert a woman's equal position with a man within the tribal systems. And lastly, the pride of Mindanao. How the moon and the stars came to be. One day, in the times when the sky was close to the ground, a spinster went out to pound rice. Before she began her work, she took off the beads from around her neck and the comb from her hair, and hung them on the sky, which at the time looked like coral rock. Then she began working, and each time that she raised her pestle into the air, it struck the sky. For some time, she pounded the rice, and then she raised the pestle so high that it struck the sky very hard. Immediately the sky began to rise, and it went up so far that she lost her ornaments. Never did they come down, for the comb became the moon, and the beads are the stars that are scattered about. Alright, so that would be all for my report. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope at this point of time, you are able to identify what is myth, their purpose, and what they entail. So once again, I am Jensen Ramos Abajo, your presenter for today.